Chapter 19. Command. We can activate our spies while lying low. Give them time to find out what we'll need to escape. And to find a new home. Circa 22 days, 38 hours since the assassination of rebel leadership. Though nerves made Uchantu's stomach twist and knot, she relaxed just a bit upon reaching the end of the sloped tunnel and seeing a small crowd waiting outside where she'd asked. After leaving Estingai, Uchantu had spent the past few hours finding everyone or finding a way to get word to those she couldn't. Stepping quietly as she approached, Uchantu smiled at Pimdunda, the Clear Eye on watch, as she stepped up beside him at the tunnel mouth. "They're all here?" "Everyone. Just make sure you aren't too loud, and keep your heads down below the rim. I haven't seen any Imaya patrols come too close, but they're out there. No aircraft, but two speeders." Uchantu's throat tightened at that. She had to take a deep breath to relax enough to speak without her voice wavering. "Thank you. We'll be careful. I'll let you know when we're done." Pimdunda nodded, then stepped past her and disappeared down the tunnel. Uchantu looked after him, then turned back toward her team. She picked out Luhuta, Naruna, and Arena, as well as Edendo and Yarn and their people. They'd helped everyone evacuate to Last Shadow, but had returned to Frozen Phantom even when most of their people had spurned Estingai's offer of aid and refuge. She hoped that counted for something with her. She'd asked them to meet here, at one of Wolfden's larger watchposts. It must have once been part of a settlement or religious site, as the low walls were too smooth and regular to be natural, and the tunnel leading here had been carved out when they'd found the place. Sometimes they used it on Aurora days for those who couldn't trek as far through the canyons or out into the desert, the wounded and what few elders they had. Today, however, Uchantu would use it to repair her broken team. "Thank you all for coming," she said, raising her voice just enough to grab their attention as she stepped forward. "I know you don't have much reason to do so after—" Uchantu had to swallow as the words caught in her throat. "After what happened?" "After your lack of trust in us screwed everything up, you mean?" Arena hissed. "What are we even doing here? What could you possibly hope to accomplish?" Arena was the only one that spoke, but a few of the others nodded, and as Uchantu looked to those she'd gathered here, she saw a reticence in their eyes, an uncertainty. "It wasn't Uchantu's fault," Naruna said, rising to her feet from where she'd sat. "I took too long with the speeder." Arena snorted. "You're right. It's both your faults. Doesn't change anything." Luhuta spoke up then, as Naruna shrank back and the sheltered area erupted into a cacophony of hushed arguments and questions. Uchantu didn't try to stop it. When it finally died down, she spoke. "I understand your hesitation, your questions, your lack of trust. But you're all here for a reason." That silenced them. The fact that you all came here even after what happened, that means something. Either you still have faith in me or you're just curious to see what I might do. Instead of arguing, please just listen to what I need to say. After that, if you don't like what I've said or you still don't trust me, you can go." Uchantu let that hang in the air, and after a few frowns and shared looks, everyone nodded, eyes fixed on her. Uchantu took a deep breath. "I want to apologize. I failed you. I didn't know if I could handle leading a team on my own without Estingai or Svimaku or Karuxi, even though Estingai believed I could. I put too much pressure on you, Arena, and on Luhuta and Edendo and Yaren. I saw you as names and abilities on a list, not as people or the parts of a team. Just something I could use to prove myself and complete the missions. I didn't trust you to be a team, and I didn't try to earn your trust or respect. I was wrong, and for that, I'm sorry." Silence stretched over the watchpost. The sun beat down on them. The walls were too low to provide much shade at this latitude. But none of them moved. None of them spoke. Uchantu braced herself when Arena finally broke the silence. I didn't really put much effort into trusting you or being a part of a team, either. Uchantu blinked at the admission and struggled to keep her expression neutral as the others all nodded or murmured in agreement. She gazed at them in amazement, and when she looked back to Arena, she found the woman studying her. I expect you have some sort of plan. We failed the last mission, so we need to make up for it, right? Uchantu smiled, then shook her head. Not exactly. Arena frowned, and Uchantu realized to how that sounded. I do have a plan, but it's not just to make up for my failure. I wouldn't ask that of you. Arena and a few of the others cocked their heads. I asked you here, Uchantu said, drawing herself up, to help me with a chance at hope. What I want to do won't just help us survive. It will help us have a chance at a better life than this. Their eyes widened, and Uchantu's heart swelled. You have to tell them. I can't give you all the details on what we're working toward, she said, looking around the group to meet their eyes. Not yet, at least. There are still some loose ends to wrap up, and I haven't even been told all the details about that. But I asked Estingai to let me give you as much as I can. Veranda, one of Enendo's people, snorted. So this is Estingai's plan. Of course she's holding things to the chest. How do we know this isn't just another power play? She's the one that caused this mess in the first place by trying to take control. Uchantu let the woman finish, then glared at her. You really think that? Veranda and a few others blinked. Estingai is one of the Knights Reborn. The last knight. She keeps secrets because we were betrayed, and she lost her husband because of it. I lost a brother. You all lost someone who protected you. I lived with the Knights, not just Estingai and Sfimaku. They weren't perfect, but grabbing for power? That way of thinking doesn't come to them. Every single one of them gave everything they had for this world, for all of you. If they take a position of power, it's because they need it to do what is right for those who depend on them. Think about that before you accuse her of being selfish. Everyone else was silent as Veranda swallowed. Uchantu held the woman's gaze, and eventually she looked down. Uchantu allowed herself a small smile at that before looking back to the others. Does anyone else have anything they need to say? There were a few murmurs, but most shook their heads. Uchantu nodded and was about to start on the plan when Naruna spoke up. Why aren't you and Karuxi knights? Uchantu blinked. No one outside of the knights and her adopted family had ever asked that of her. Yet a few others nodded, murmuring in agreement. I've wondered that too, Arena said. Both of you, you're not Estingai, but I've seen you fight. You're far above any of us. And you were trained by the same people that trained Estingai and Sfimaku and the other knights, right? Yarn asked. Uchantu nodded. She thought for a moment before answering, working out how best to explain it. It's because we're not Estingai. She let that hang in the air long enough for everyone to ponder it before she continued. The knights were something more than just great leaders or warriors or scientists. They were more even than devoted followers of Kwashrima. They gave everything. Being a knight wasn't just something they did or a code they tried to follow. It was who they were. They had to give up a lot for that. Too much, in our opinion. She sighed. Karuxi and I didn't want that for ourselves. We'd seen the toll it took on Estingai and Sfimaku and on their parents and the others we lived and trained with. Even the knights that pursued science and things like administration and logistics rather than combat were changed by it, and not always in a good way. Though they did great things. We thought the war would be over. We wanted to live our own lives, so we chose not to take that last step and join the knights. Uchantu looked around the watch post with a wry grin. Obviously, we miscalculated a bit, but neither of us regret it. Silence took hold of the watchpost again for a while. Luhuta broke it this time. What's your plan? What are we doing that is more than just a raid to keep surviving? Uchantu smiled and stepped forward, joining the group. She took a datapad from her side, then knelt down in the middle of the watchpost. Exeli, she said, looking to the short, broad-faced Samyadi. You have your black nodes bright? He nodded. Uchantu smiled, then brightened her gem crest. Though she'd memorized it, Uchantu looked to the map of the docks on her datapad to make this a bit easier. She recreated the map in golden light, showing the shape and height of buildings and representations of fighters, boats, shipping containers, and other vehicles. Getting it right had taken a few hours of practice, even with the foundation of Aitiparit's teachings. But as the others leaned in, Uchantu knew it had been worth it. That's Diedu, Edendo breathed. Uchantu nodded. The port city was the only one still inhabited on the subcontinent's northern coast, so the Amaya concentrated a lot of personnel and armaments there, using it as a military outpost instead of just a transfer station for resources and people on their way to and from Darkside. This is going to be risky, she said, but after how things went at Memposo, it will be the last thing they expect. What's the objective? Arena asked. Uchantu grinned, looking around at the group. We're going to steal fighters, artillery, transports, and a few shipping containers, wipe out their records, and destroy as many of the remaining vehicles as possible on the way out. This will be our last raid for a while because of how much disruption it will cause, and we will have to lay low. No more raids, as little travel between the different bases as we can manage, but it will give us more ships. Ones with weapons and better engines and georural tech. That seems a bit out there after we failed so spectacularly at Memposo, Muzuri said. A few of the others murmured or nodded in agreement. Uchantu was one of them. It is, but we don't really have any other options. Estingai needed us to hit the Amaya 3 more times after Memposo for her original plan. With the Amaya on high alert after we failed, we only have one chance. She paused, looking around at the group. We either try something so big the Amaya won't expect it, or we give up now. And what does this plan get us? Yaron asked. What will we accomplish by stealing more ships and hitting the Amaya so hard? A chance at stealing an even bigger ship. As eyes widened and a few nervous grins broke out, Uchantu knew she had them. Still, she was surprised when Naruna spoke up. What's the plan? Uchantu smiled and looked around the group again. I have a rough outline of one, but that won't be enough. This is something we need to come up with together. I know how I would attack this, but I want your approaches, your perspectives, and all of your skills besides your auroromancy and fighting abilities. I need you to see the things I don't. Edendo? Everyone's gaze turned to the pilot. You recognize the port. Any ideas? Edendo blinked, and his eyes darted around to all those looking at him. But then Yaron took his husband's hand, and the pilot relaxed. I would go for the fighters first. As Edendo explained his approach, and those around leaned in and occasionally nodded in agreement, Uchantu smiled, excitement building within her. We can do this. Estingai frowned at the guards flanking the door as she approached Wolfden's command room. She brightened her clear nodes to make out the snowflake symbols on their masks, then nodded, straightening her spine and rolling her shoulders. She dimmed her clear nodes, but not completely. She recognized the first two, Akadi and Imbe, but the others must have been from Icevein or Stormswind. The two she did not recognize moved between her and the door as she approached, and she fixed their masked faces with an icy glare. The light-forged armor she wore helped. She hadn't finished repairing it completely, but it would function as well as she needed it to. She'd also made some modifications. The light-forged mask now adorned the chest plate, and she'd attached her own mask to the helmet, which hung at her hip. They are in a meeting, the closest, a woman said. We've been instructed not to let you or Uchantu in. Estingai raised an eyebrow, looking at the woman and her companion, then looked past them to the other two guards. Sama, Akadi said, I think we should just let her through. Sama looked over her shoulder. Just because she's... You should listen to him, Estingai said, voice low but firm. I've had a bad day, and Akadi and Imbe will tell you that I'm not the best at controlling my temper. The two foreign guards studied her for a moment, then shared a look and stepped aside, the woman letting out a sigh. Akadi opened the door. As Estingai passed by them and through the door, the woman hissed, This better not get us written up. The heavy metal doors closed behind Estingai, and she found herself facing Aiden, Maryatla, Uldina, and Meika, all staring at her with expressions ranging from bewilderment to hostility. What are you doing here? Aiden asked, an edge to his voice as Meika turned her glare on Maryatla. Your guards must have let her in. Estingai didn't respond. She took a deep breath, studying each of the four leaders in turn. Maryatla had helped run her family's textile business, and Aiden had been a legal clerk. Both had chosen to stand against the Amaya rather than bow to it when the time had come. And though Estingai didn't know much about who Uldina and Meika had been before the destruction, she could respect the choices they'd made to fight rather than compromise their beliefs for a life of relative safety and security. Regardless, each were leaders in their own right. They might have personal agendas, but they were also influenced by what they thought they must do for their people. And you're the last knight. No matter who they were or who they are now, you stand above them. Kuruxi and Uchantu are the only ones with anything near that claim. These four worry about themselves and their people. You need to worry about what is best for all those who fight the Amaya, even those you might not agree with. That was what they'd sworn. It didn't matter if the goddess she'd sworn to had betrayed her and sent the world into a death spiral. The oath itself was worth keeping. This has nothing to do with you, Estingai, Maryatla said, voice cool. Especially after that mess of yours at Memphoso, Uldina added. Have you come to take control now that we've forced you out? Meika spat. Estingai nodded. That's exactly what I'm doing. The four leaders stared at her, eyes wide. The room fell silent except for the low hum of electronic equipment. Meika even gaped. Uldina was the first to regain her tongue. You have no right, don't I? Estingai was surprised at how calm she felt, despite the energy that still thrummed through the room. There's no more room for disagreement anymore, she continued, between the five of us or with Iron Peak and Last Shadow. All that does is benefit the Amaya. Each of you can handle the day-to-day operations of our people and work out amongst yourselves who handles what. Ideally, you will each specialize in something befitting your strengths rather than just administering over your own bases, but it will all be under my direction. If things are not working the way they should, I will step in to take action. You think all you need to do is interrupt me and say a few words to take over? Uldina spat. That arrogance alone disqualifies you from any sort of leadership position. You may have once been one of the Knights Reborn, Meika said, but I have seen none of that in the past few weeks. Estingai clenched her teeth. What could she say to that? Any excuse would sound like a child's protest. You may have shocked us with your Lightforged armor the first time, Uldina said, but that won't work any longer. Not after your inconsistent behavior and unwillingness to back up your reputation with any action. Estingai sighed. I have not been myself recently. None of us have, Meika snapped. We live our lives in caves. We have all lost those we cared about or looked up to, Estingai. Losing your husband does not make you special. Estingai took a deep breath, looking both Meika and Uldina in the eye before she spoke. And how many of you are the last of an order that everyone looked to
to save them. Uldina opened her mouth for a moment, then closed it. Neither spoke. Which of you is always associated with the goddess that said she would protect us, but instead broke the world? Estingai pressed. With living legends who took on the God King himself and managed to wound him. Uldina shifted under her gaze, and Estingai looked around the room. You were all thrust into leadership unexpectedly, but you'd been trained for it. You knew that might be a possibility someday. I fought alongside legends, men and women who seemed more like the goddess we served than mortals who needed to do things like eat and drink to live. Yours is a role people expect to be filled. The Knights were something beyond what people expected. Some of them had lived and fought the Amaya and its predecessors for centuries. They wielded power greater than any I could ever hope to wield. And yet I alone am expected to take their place at our bleakest moment. I alone must walk through our halls and bear the looks of everyone who expected the Knights and Questrima to save them, to know the unspoken questions behind their haunted eyes. Why did Questrima betray us? Why didn't you protect them? Why must we live like this? Estingai paused, nearly raising a hand to her throat at the rawness of her voice. She looked to Uldina, then Meika. You're right, she told Iceveins' leader. Losing my husband doesn't make me special. We have all lost loved ones. We have all lost those we looked to for strength. Estingai stepped toward Meika. But you still have me. Whether you see me as someone who will save you or someone to blame when everything goes to Vitu. You still have someone who is supposed to be above the rest of you. I had only Svemaku. And now I have to be that person you all look up to. Without anyone who understands that burden. Without anyone to share it. Meika's jaw bunched as she held Estingai's gaze. The woman swallowed and said nothing. Silence stretched as Estingai's words hung in the air. And for a moment, Estingai nearly smiled. We will have to take harsher action to ensure she doesn't subvert our authority, Meika said, looking to Maryatla. You know her. Do you have any suggestions? Estingai's heart sank, but she set her jaw. She had to keep fighting. Before Estingai could say anything, however, Maryatla spoke up. I agree with Meika. However, I chose to expel Estingai from our confidence because she had refused to take ownership of her role. Maryatla paused, meeting Estingai's gaze. Estingai nodded and caught the other woman's lips twitch in the hint of a smile. I believe that issue is past, Maryatla continued, and that the best way to ensure she doesn't subvert our authority is to put ourselves beneath her. Uldina and Meika, who had both been smiling up until then, gaped at Maryatla. You can't be serious, Uldina objected. She is the last knight, Aiden said. Something she seems to have finally embraced. Our people respect her, Maryatla added. All of our people, especially our soldiers. If Estingai chooses to take charge in finding us a way out of this life, you will find yourselves hard-pressed to convince your people not to follow her. Maryatla turned her gaze to Estingai once more. That is, assuming she has a plan to get us out of this. Estingai nodded, stepping up to the table at the center of the room. I have the beginnings of one. The plan my husband proposed when all the factions met and their leaders agreed to forge us into the Remnant. That I will need your help with, as it will take years. As to our first step, though, forging the Remnant, I know what we need to do. As Estingai laid out the plan, Maryatla, Aiden, Uldina, and Meika all leaned in to listen. The heads of Icevane and Stormswind still wore frowns, and Estingai knew she had a ways to go before winning them over. But it was a start. When she got to the part those two would play, their frowns deepened, but Maryatla and Aiden nodded, encouraged, and Estingai reached back to grip the handle of her pan.